Hello, my name is Kathleen Urban. I'm the content specialist for social emotional learning with Brevard County Schools. Today we'll be learning more about restorative practices. First, let's review the objectives for today's presentation. We will be discussing why schools and educators should know more about restorative practices and the benefits to the school community that restorative practices can bring. We'll review what restorative practices are by defining them and understanding the frameworks that the restorative practices continuum is based on. And finally, how we can incorporate restorative practices concepts in the school community. First, let's talk about why we should know more about restorative practices. The cornerstone statement of the 2020 through 2025 Brevard Public Schools Strategic Plan states in part, social emotional wellness is the foundation on which children develop and learn. Students who receive support for social emotional learning in schools do better academically, socially, and behaviorally. Developing these skills in our students is an important part of meeting the needs of the whole child. Due to the foundational support of this cornerstone to academic success, a specific objective, A3, is dedicated that addresses this cornerstone directly. And you will see that strategy S2 specifically addresses the district's plan to include restorative practices in this goal. In its training literature for professionals, the International Institute for Restorative Practices has documented numerous benefits to implementation in schools. Some of those include moving towards a more inclusive school community, finding connectedness in an increasingly disconnected world, fewer class disruptions, reduced discipline referrals, and decreased reliance on exclusionary practices. Data from schools who have implemented restorative practices includes significant reductions in misbehavior and punitive discipline in grades K through 12, improved teacher-student relationships in classrooms with high level of restorative practices implementation, and evidence that this improvement tends to narrow the racial discipline gap, a concern in schools nationwide. Additionally, restorative practices can fit into strategies you may already be using in your school, such as the Sanford Harmony Social Emotional Learning Curriculum and PBIS. And when we look at the problem-solving framework as it relates to behavior, mental health, school climate, and social emotional skills, we see that daily restorative practices is a Tier 1 support for positive school climate. Okay, so we have briefly reviewed the why of restorative practices. Now let's take a closer look at what restorative practices are. Restorative practices is a social science that studies how to build social capital and achieve social discipline through participatory learning and decision making. Restorative practices puts its primary efforts into proactive strategies that precede any harm that might be done. To go into further detail, restorative practices falls into two categories: proactive or preventative measures and reactive or responsive measures. Many people think of restorative practices solely as a responsive or restorative measure after wrongdoing has occurred. For a school to be considered fully implementing restorative practices, they should be using techniques in both the proactive and responsive categories. By having the proactive strategies in place, students will be building the relationships and social capital necessary for the responsive practices to be most effective. The more time you spend here, the less time you have to spend here. It's also important to realize that using restorative practices is not a fad or a temporary trend in education. It's not a disciplinary tool, and it is not therapy or counseling. Now that we've reviewed the general definition of restorative practices and the proactive and responsive categories of practice, let's briefly review its supporting framework. The International Institute for Restorative Practices has defined several concepts that it views as most helpful in understanding and explaining restorative practices. Typically, we think of the range of possible responses to misbehavior or wrongdoing falling on a limited or linear continuum. This continuum illustrates how our society perceives possible responses to wrongdoing. The punitive response, which is commonly found in traditional disciplinary approaches in schools, limits educators to a simple choice: to punish or not to punish without addressing the social, emotional, behavioral, or mental health needs of the students. If we are not punitive, we are considered to be permissive. With restorative practices, we move beyond the linear single axis of the punitive-permissive continuum. Examining the interplay between the two axes, one for control or limit setting and another for support or nurturing, results in the social discipline window. This allows for 4 resulting combinations. High control with low support is punitive. High support with low control is permissive. Those mirror the 2 linear simplistic choices available on the punitive-permissive continuum that we just looked at. When we consider low control with low support, behaviors spin out of control, adults abdicate their authority, and it characterizes a neglectful school. When there is high control with high support, those in authority exercise their control, refusing to accept inappropriate behavior, but do so in a caring and supportive way. This is the restorative response to wrongdoing. The idea is to support students and engage them in finding ways to curb their own negative behavior. The restorative domain combines both high control and high support and is characterized by doing things with people rather than to them or for them. Based on the work of psychologist Sylvan Tompkins, the psychology of affect helps us better understand why human beings act and respond in certain ways and why restorative practices works so well. According to Tompkins, affects are 9 innate biological instantaneous reactions to stimuli in one's environment. It is more difficult, if not impossible, to concentrate or learn if a child is in one of the negative affects. Restorative practices works to move children from an area of negative affect to a more neutral and positive affect, thereby readying them for learning. Donald Nathanson, a psychiatrist who built on Tompkins's work, focused his attention on the affect of shame. He defines shame as a reaction to the interruption of a positive affect. Nathanson explains that an individual doesn't have to do something wrong to feel shame. For example, it's possible that a victim of crime often feels shame even though they did nothing wrong. Nathanson describes 4 ways in which we react to shame. Attack other, demonstrated when we blame others for what we've done or we lash out at people around us. When we put ourselves down with comments like "I'm so stupid" or "this is all my fault," we are in the attack self area of the shame compass. Avoidance usually manifests in denial or ignoring the feelings of shame, but it may also lead to the abuse of drugs or alcohol. And finally, withdrawal is exemplified by a person pulling away, clamming up, or wanting to run and hide. As educators, being aware of the compass of shame gives us the perspective we need to be restorative when faced with an inappropriate behavior. The last framework we'll be looking at before we move on is fair process. Fairness is an essential ingredient of successful change. Fair process simply means that people are treated in a respectful way. Remember that working in the restorative domain is characterized by doing things with people rather than to them or for them. The key principles of fair process, engagement, explanation, and clarifying expectations, closely involves the students or the person doing the harm. It's also important to remember that fair process does not mean a democracy. When people feel that they've been treated fairly, they're more likely to cooperate with the decisions made and the consequences given, even if the outcomes are not what they desired. So now we have a better understanding of what restorative practices are and the frameworks they are based on. Let's talk about how restorative practices is implemented in schools. The restorative practices continuum is an essential framework to effective implementation. It'll help us when we discuss the various ways that restorative practices can be done in the school community. The use of informal restorative practices dramatically reduces the need for the more time-consuming formal restorative practices. 80% of the work we need to do should be done in the preventative, informal part of the continuum. Let's take a closer look at these more informal daily restorative practices. Affective statements can be a building block for teaching empathy to students. Typically, these are I statements, sharing with students how something made you feel. Encourage your students to use these statements with you when they are happy, frustrated, upset, or angry. Students can also use affective statements when talking to their peers. Restorative practices helps revise our thinking so that we see conflict in a school setting as an opportunity to foster learning and build better relationships. Affective questions can be used when responding to challenging behavior or helping those who have been harmed by another's actions. You will most often use just one or two of these questions in an informal way for a quick exchange, but no matter how brief, each intervention provides an opportunity for young people to reflect on the impact of their behavior. Note that "why did you do that" is absent from this list. Small impromptu conversations build on the use of affective statements and affective questions to address a problem and keep it from escalating. These conversations are used to keep students actively engaged in expressing their feelings and in thinking about the impact their behaviors have on others. Consider this scenario. Two students are arguing or fighting to use the slide on the playground. The first adult response may stop the problem for that moment, but because their frustration was not resolved, the student's conflict may continue to arise later in the day or even beyond that. Now let's take a look at a small impromptu conversation utilizing both affective statements and questions. Once a student answers, the adult moves on to another affective question. To keep the responses on track, use statements like "we are talking about you right now" and repeat the affective question. People like to have their say. By asking the questions, each child reflected on the conflict. The adult became the facilitator rather than the disciplinarian. All right, now we will move on to the more formal practices on the restorative continuum. Circles are one of the most distinctive and flexible forms of restorative practices. Sitting in circles can create a feeling that a group of people is connected. Circles are a powerful process to proactively build bonds and community. Circles can also be used in a proactive or a responsive manner. Proactive circles can be used for a daily check-in, check-out, developing and maintaining classroom norms, teaching academic content, addressing behaviors proactively, as well as goal setting in the classroom. Responsive circles can address classroom behavior problems like bullying, name calling, or as a reminder of certain school protocols, like maybe after a class forgot how to line up and get their lunch or walk out to the playground. A responsive circle can also be used to address a classroom issue when the offender is unknown, like when an item goes missing, for example. However, if an issue only involves one or two students, a small impromptu conversation may be more appropriate than a responsive circle. Next, we're going to go into some more detail about different types of circles that you can be running in your classroom. Please remember that each of the three types of circles can be used in either a proactive or a responsive manner, but we want to spend most of our time in that proactive manner. A sequential go-around circle is one in which a question or discussion point is raised and students answer in turn, proceeding in a clockwise or counterclockwise fashion while passing a talking piece. A volunteer may offer to go first, answer the question, and choose the direction that the talking piece moves. The teacher may choose a volunteer or answer the question or start the topic themselves, then pass the talking piece in either direction. The most important benefit of a sequential go-around is that it provides a voice for all students, including the quiet or shy children. By providing a space for all students to contribute, the applications of the sequential go-around circle are limitless. For example, you can do a feelings check-in with students to gauge how ready they are to learn that morning or how confident they are in a new academic concept. Non-sequential circles are more freely structured than the sequential go-arounds. Conversation proceeds from one person to another in no fixed order. This type of circle allows a discussion to evolve organically and can be used effectively for problem solving as well. A few things to keep in mind when using a non-sequential circle. Ground rules should be established so that everyone understands the format, and the format will vary depending on the activity. The amount of structure also depends on the maturity level of the students. Teachers know their students best, so they should use their best judgment when deciding on how strict or flexible the ground rules for the non-sequential circle will be. Unlike sequential go-arounds, not everyone is guaranteed a chance to speak. So you may want to consider a concluding sequential go-around question or wrap-up activity to put some closure on everything. The fishbowl circle allows the inner circle participants to be active in problem solving or discussions, while those in the outer circle are observers. Fishbowls can be structured entirely for the observer's benefit so they can witness or learn a specific process. When a fishbowl circle uses the empty chair, observers from the outer circle can opt into the inner circle to provide feedback. The last item on the restorative practices continuum is formal restorative conferencing. Restorative conferences are a formal response to wrongdoing where all of those involved and affected by an incident come together with a trained facilitator to explore what happened, who was affected, and what needs to be done to make things right. Because restorative conferencing is very time consuming and used in very few situations for a few students, think of it as a tier 3, it's not a routine classroom process. Okay, we have reached the end of the restorative practices overview PowerPoint. I have included some optional videos that your school administrators may choose to show you and some handouts as well. Thank you so much for your attention today and have a great school year.